The China Wars. Most people in the United States see China as the future of the world. The Chinese rise during the past 3 decades has been nothing but spectacular. But what is almost never considered is why now? If China's rise is so inevitable, why is it that only now, some 3,500 years after the Han Chinese first emerged as an ethnicity, is Chinese dominance so obvious and inevitable? The first warning that not all is as it seems is that the China mythos is ingrained nowhere more deeply than in the American psyche. The same psyche that was recently convinced of the obvious and inevitable rise of the Soviet Union and Japan. The reality of China is considerably different from the conventional wisdom. There are many reasons to doubt the strength of the Chinese system, but let's focus on those relevant to things geographic and demographic. Chinese geography is, if anything, more problematic than European geography. China's dominant Han ethnic group traces its roots to early cultures along the Yellow River in what is today northern China. But the Yellow is not a friendly river. It is extremely flood-prone. Seasonal rains in multiple parts of the watershed lead to large-scale flooding at various times of the year. The Yellow is also not tightly contained in a narrow valley as the Nile is, but instead flows through an extremely broad and very flat floodplain. When the river overflows its banks, it regularly inundates broad swaths of territory, far in excess of the sorts of floodings that are common and largely constrained in reach elsewhere in the world. Chinese society has developed along starkly different lines than Western versions. Chinese political development manifested less out of a need to manage food surpluses and expand populations than out of a need to manage the ravages of the Yellow River. One result among many was a much tighter hold by the government on the populace. Work gangs were regularly formed to construct river levees stretching for miles, not simply to guard populated areas, but agricultural fields as well. China may be better known for its Great Wall and Grand Canal, but the Han's tethering of the Yellow was the first and the greatest of their mass construction works. As the years turned into centuries, these levees expanded to contain nearly all of the river's lower reaches, which actually compounded the problem. While all rivers carry silt, the Yellow's silt load is particularly heavy. Once the river became in essence a managed canal, it couldn't dump its silt in the floodplain. The steady accumulation of sediment resulted in the rise of the river bottom over the centuries. Successive Chinese governments had no choice but to build the river levees higher. At some time in the last millennium, the lower Yellow started defying the classification of river and became more of a raised aqueduct, with its bottom now above the elevation of the surrounding lands. When the Yellow bursts its banks, the entirety of its flow crashes down into the plains that are now beneath it, unleashing heretofore unheard of floods that dispossess Chinese in hundreds of thousands. A single flood in 1931 killed more than 1 million people. The result is that a successful Chinese government must be very tightly managed. The people must be fashioned in such a way that they can be hurled at engineering problems. Failure to maintain such organizational control at all times means that something as innocuous as a hard rain could literally wash Chinese civilization away. But this tendency toward unitary political systems hasn't granted a history of more unified and coherent governments. On the contrary, China is a land of failed empires and shattered hopes. Again, the reason is geographic. The Yellow River's lower watershed is the North China Plain, a wide, vast landscape completely empty of internal geographic barriers. Like its northern European equivalent, the NCP is incredibly fertile and absolutely huge. At 158,000 square miles, it is as large as the prime agricultural lands of the US states of Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois combined. But that is where the similarities end. The long, thin nature of the North European plain resulted in multiple competing powers, each arising from and defending its own segment of the plain, often using the NEP's many transecting rivers as defensive lines. The North China Plain, in contrast, has no thin dimension, and is instead broad and deep with only the Yellow River bisecting it. The wide open space of the NCP encouraged cultural and linguistic unity, but not political unity. There are no local geographies from within which a local power could arise independently of its neighbors, and any local power that does successfully cohere is forced to use a great deal of its labor resources to tame the river. That commitment makes the successful power vulnerable, leaving less manpower available for defense. A rival does not even need to defeat it in battle, or even target the riverworks. It can simply distract the population at a critical time, such as during a hard rain, and let nature wash away the competition. Unlike the NEP's host of navigable rivers, the Yellow is not navigable in part due to its heavy engineering. Northern China is as capital poor as Northern Europe is capital rich. Since capital has not traditionally been available in China in large volumes, and because high levels of labor concentration and control have been required to hold the river in place, and so are not available for things like technological development, China has not known the high levels of development or fast rates of technological advance that the West enjoyed once the Dark Ages ended. Where the NEP receives ample rainfall year-round, the NCP is subject to frequent periods of heavy flooding, even without the Yellow River's particular problems, or drought. The result has been regular population booms and busts, and a bust that reduces the population is one that risks allowing the river to rage out of control in the next wet season. The only way to endure a drought is to engage in large-scale irrigation, which requires mastering the river, making you a target for everyone else. Strategically, the result is a region shattered by multiple competing powers perfectly willing to inflict mass civilian casualties upon each other and even hurl their collective civilization down in order to gain a tactical advantage. The Chinese quite accurately refer to long stretches of their own history as the Warlord Era. Unifying northern China into an all-Han zone took nothing less than millennia of wars, civil conflict, and ethnic cleansing. And even once that was achieved, maintaining its unity requires a degree of oppression that is onerous by nearly anyone's standards but Beijing's own. The Chinese Civil War between the forces of Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, complete with its 7 million deaths, was but the most recent incarnation of this eternal pattern. Economically, the result is a system with little trade and even less technological innovation. The northern Chinese system is instead dependent upon the application of labor, mass labor, to whatever problems arise. Even the traditional Chinese staple food fits the pattern. Wheat requires sowing, harvesting, and threshing, and the rest of a wheat farmer's time could be spent on other exploits. Not so for paddy rice. It must be prepared before planting, planted stalk by stalk in specially prepared clay beds that can hold water. Flooded, fertilized, emptied, flooded again, emptied and dried, harvested stalk by stalk, threshed, threshed again, followed by a